We are joined today, I'm excited to announce, with Rabbi Daniel Schonbuch. He is a Brooklyn-based licensed marriage and family therapist, author, leading expert in Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, which is really cool, and you want to learn more about it. If you go ahead on to Sirius XM, I had an interview, by the way, with the grandson of Viktor Frankl, and the rabbi here, he's involved in so many things. He works with a coaching firm. He's a founder and owner of the Torah Psychology School of Coaching and Counseling, operates his own private practice in, in Brooklyn, and he deals with people that have very serious problems: trauma, depression, anxiety, addiction, relationship difficulties. He does it all, and I am really excited to have him here today. Rabbi, let's start with why you have been so interested in Viktor Frankl, who, I just think is his book, Man's Search for Meaning, one of the most important books, I think, written in the 20th century. Tell me how you got involved, why you're interested, and go from there.
I'm very interested in Viktor Frankl because I'm finding out, as a therapist working in the field for many years, that the greatest challenge facing the United States of America right now, especially our youth, is the absence of meaning, or what I'd call meaninglessness. So many years ago, I sought out advice on this, and I found the books of Viktor Frankl to be very enriching. But the challenge was, in the schools of psychotherapy in the United States, they haven't embraced Viktor Frankl. And therefore, people don't know about Viktor Frankl, and you don't study his work on campus. And I had to really seek out my own training to learn more about Viktor Frankl. And I started writing a lot about him. And as I developed my writings, I think America got more into meaninglessness. So I thought my message really took off, because it's a psychotherapy which helps people find meaning, which means there's less focus on the self, which was a lot about psychotherapy. It's all about the self, self-fulfillment, self-awareness, and ego. Viktor Frankl said that you become healthy when you go beyond yourself and not just focus on yourself.
Well, let's talk about two of these philosophers. Adler, who believed that life was man's search for power, and of course Freud, who said that it was man's search for pleasure. And here along comes Viktor Frankl saying it's man's search for meaning. Why do you think that Frankl was ignored?
He was ignored because Sigmund Freud took over in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Freud was everything. Extremely powerful, extremely influential, but extremely secular, and really rejected religion. He rejected God. He rejected the soul. He saw man more as like an animal or a computer, let's say. Adler was a protege of Freud, and he saw it's more about power, this idea of feeling powerless in society. And Frankl came along and said, I disagree with all of you. It's really about man's search for meaning. In other words, if we peel a person down to his core, what are we going to find? Now, Frankl said, interesting to note, that man also has a desire for pleasure and for power, but when he doesn't find it, he descends down to there. But if he doesn't find, he has to find meaning, so to speak. He has a desire for meaning, but if he doesn't find meaning, he'll descend down to power and to pleasure, which is so interesting. And that's where I see a lot of society going to, looking for help towards pleasure and power, as opposed to finding meaning.
So, Rabbi, in your search, investigation, research into Frankl, do you think, how much of his time in the concentration camps do you believe contributed to that philosophy? In other words, where was he before Auschwitz and these other camps where he was interned? And then how much during and how much after? Now, I'm very well aware of a lot of his writing, at least in Man's Search for Meaning, that, it's not what we expect from life, it's what life expects from us. One of his famous his lines, that he said that when people could not find hope in circumstances, they would lose their way. In suffering, if they couldn't find hope in suffering, that's why they'd run to the wire and take their own lives. How much of his philosophy, you think, was shaped by this horrific time he spent in these camps?
It's a fantastic question. Viktor Frankl actually addresses this. He wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning just after the Holocaust. And it was really called The Psychology of the Concentration Camps. And whoever marketed him in America called it Man's Search for Meaning, and they sold it. He was very upset about this. I just watched a video recently. He talks about how upset he was because he didn't discover this in Auschwitz. He discovered this way before this in the 1920s. When he got to Auschwitz, he then says he experienced what he talked about in his writings already. It just kind of reinforced him. He said there wasn't a sexual drive in the camps, for example. But what people could find, and as you mentioned before, when they're powerless, when they have no freedom, he says they could experience the ultimate of freedoms is choosing one's attitude. So it's sort of like a litmus test, Auschwitz, as opposed to the place he discovered it, as his marketers promoted.
Well, how do you think he came up with this then early on? How old was he when he started to think about this? How do you think he got there?
Well, he was born in 1905, and he already says when he was 16, he was actually corresponding with Sigmund Freud. He was already interested in Freud. He developed his own ideas. I think he was sitting in a science class one day, and they were talking about atomic structure. He said, if man is just a bag of chemicals and atoms, what purpose does he have in life? I think that was something Frankl talked about a lot. I think he was just a seeker of knowledge. And for some reason, maybe unconsciously or consciously, it's interesting. Freud talked about the id, this impulsive desire for pleasure, the id, right? Frankl called it the religio. He said there's something deeper than the id. There's something called the religio, man's search for spirituality and godliness, which is really inherent in human beings. I think he was just able to detect that which was there already and manifest it in his own work.
One of the things he says in this book, and it's not really pounding on religion, but in a way it is, Rabbi, and that is where he says, and I don't have the book in front of me, but he says something about, imagine for a second that there's another dimension and that all the things we see now ultimately get resolved in the next dimension. What do you think he meant by that?
He said that we are projected from a higher dimension. We live in the world of three dimensions, the physical world. Excuse me. He says that man actually comes from a higher dimension, the world of nous, which in Greek I believe means spirituality or meaning. And we're actually projected from that world into this world. We only see a 3D vision of ourselves, kind of limited, but we come from a higher place, so to speak. He's talking philosophically about the soul, I believe,
Yeah.
from a scientific perspective, perhaps a mathematical perspective, maybe a physical perspective. But we really come from that higher place. As it talks about in the Bible, when God breathed a breath into man, the first man, God did the first CPR in human history. He breathed a part of himself in the Bible, we believe. And therefore, there's a part of God within us. And I think Viktor Frankl said he recognized it, and he was very interested psychologically. How do we arouse that he called it the religio again. How do we arouse that part of ourselves in therapy? Whereas Sigmund Freud was taking on a very anti-religious perspective. He wrote a book called Moses and Monotheism. He said God was just a projection of the Jewish people's fears in the desert, for example. They needed some figure to protect them. And Frankl really contradicts, says, no, he says religion and God is a very human process, a very human phenomenon. We have to embrace it. And that's why he was really rejected, because the Geist of the time, independent of Freud, he lived in Vienna. It was a very secular place. That was the same time period where Albert Einstein, it was all about reductionism, E equals MC squared. We have to reduce things. We have to reduce man to certain quanta. And so Freud took us back to the example of an animal. And he says, no, we're a human being. We're uniquely human. We come from this higher dimension. And that's why he was rejected by psychotherapy. He took on a very religious perspective 100 years ago. The whole world was becoming secularized. Freud was the king of that, unfortunately. And that's why we didn't study him. I went to graduate school. We never learned about Viktor Frankl. And it's interesting. My book called Viktor Frankl and the Psychology of the Soul, which I wrote last year, was teaching people how to utilize Frankl's works in psychotherapy, because the schools of psychotherapy do not teach his works. I set out to describe, how do I use him in therapy? How can people access Viktor Frankl on a personal level?
How'd the book do?
Well, the book did very well. I'm not the biggest author in the world, but I sold about 5,000 copies on Amazon, and I sold other 2,000 copies in bookstores. So for me, that was quite successful from my writing experience. But I felt there was tremendous response. I've had interviews all around the country, and people have reached out to me all around the world, Jews, non-Jews, to talk about something that they've been lacking deeply in psychotherapy, because their therapists were not trained to, accept their psychological need for spirituality and God. They actually would reject it. So people seek out my help because they say, yes, I am a spiritual person. I might not be a practicing Catholic or practicing Christian or practicing Jew or Muslim for that matter, but I'm seeking out spirituality and my therapist doesn't allow me to experience. And that's what Viktor Frankl has done for me as a therapist. He gave me the license to explore spirituality in a structured way with with our clients, and that's why I promoted his work in my latest book.
Well, Rabbi, let's talk. We've got a number of things I want to get to here, but as I'm making notes as you're speaking, actually, let's talk about therapy versus the issue of faith. I'm a believer that I think that's the combination one needs. In other words, if you have faith in a loving God, and the concept would be, or for me, the reality would be that God is good, God loves me, wants the best for me, and that He's always there, which gives me a sense of a foundation and a strength. That in and of itself is not enough to be able to deal with the problems I have related to trauma or anxiety, addiction, whatever. You combine that with therapy, which is the hard work, right? But therapy as distinguished from faith. Put them together. We have someone who's always there, and we have therapy, which allows us to go through whatever it is in our lives that affected us, that puts us in this position. You react to what I've just said.
Well, it's very true. Frankl also said that logotherapy, this therapy of meaning, did not come to replace psychotherapy. It came to complete it. So there's many good techniques in psychotherapy. I've been trained in many schools. For example, I do something called EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing for traumatic experiences, or somatic experiencing, or something called cognitive behavioral therapy. The difficulty is it doesn't go far enough. And so we can utilize psychology to work through certain levels of trauma, but we have to rise above that at some level. And that's what Viktor Frankl's logotherapy did. It enabled the psychotherapist to say, okay, I've reached a limit. I've explored myself. I've explored my traumatic experiences therapeutically, which are very important. But now I want to go even further than that. And I want to be close to God. When people really get close to God, I think God has a bad rap, to be honest with you, in society. In our generations that we've lived the last few years, people think that God becoming religious, so to speak, was becoming more violent or a racist or something. But really, at least according to Judaism, the more I get close to God, the greater I feel a sense of calmness, of peacefulness, and I emote love through that relationship.
And why? And why, Rabbi? Why would that be?
Because God's greatest action in history was the act of creation. He gave space for himself in this world. This world didn't exist according to Jewish law, according to the Bible a few thousand years ago it was created. So we believe the world just existed infinitely. And at some point in history, God decided to create the world. He had to give space to this creation, to give of himself to this world for the world to exist. So because we're created in the image of God, according to the Bible, we want to imitate God's ways. Does that make sense to you?
Yes. I mean, it makes total sense. But there's another issue that I bring up to you that people, we might lose some people on this, but I need to bring it up. And that's the issue of natural law. A natural law is the sense, if I have this right, and you're the doctor and you're the rabbi, but natural law to me means that every human being is implanted with a sense of right and wrong, basic right and wrong, no matter where they live, no matter who they are, no matter what they look like. Natural law is something that gives us direction as human beings to be able to frankly live together, succeed, and rise. What do you think about that?
Yeah, we do have an inherent sense, but I think we're losing our way in society. I think perhaps our generations, older generations, had that sense. I think because of the internet today, because of a lot of violence in society, a lot of problems we're having, I think people have lost that internal compass. The natural law, I think it's there, but it's highly covered up, so to speak. So people do need some star above them to reach out to it. It's interesting. Viktor Frankl spoke about the Bible in his writings. He said when the Jewish people were wandering in the desert, God protected them at night with a flame, and during the day he had these clouds that took them through the desert. But it says in the Bible the clouds were ahead of the nation of Israel. He says meaning is always discovered something beyond you. God was God was guiding us something beyond ourselves in the desert as well. So I think we do need some new guidance on how to achieve that spiritual relationship with God because society's been so anti-religious. We've been programmed against it. We don't know where it is anymore. Even if we have it internally, you're mentioning natural law, we still need some guidance how to get beyond it.
Rabbi, my sense about it is that natural law is, I mean, to me, and that's, I'm trying to remember the Christian philosopher, Thomas Aquinas, the one that developed the concept of natural law. I think we all have it, but I think you're right from the standpoint that it can be eroded. In other words, like one of my friends says, follow your conscience. I said the problem is in today's culture with not just social media, but the drift of, I say the drift, the actions of society, sometimes we can lose that sense of natural law, but it's still there. And but it's very interesting. I want to go back to something else you said because I think it's critical that we think about this, and then I would be interested in what you think we could do about it. Young people today, if they don't see heroes, if they don't see meaning, they drift, right?
That's exactly what Frankl was saying. If they don't have meaning, they go back to pleasure from the Freudian perspective or to power. And that's what we're seeing.
I see. Yeah, that's very, very astute. What are we going to do about it, Rabbi?
Well, I want to add one thing to it. When on October 7th, the worst attack against Jews since the Holocaust happened, we saw our college campuses flooded by Hamas and people supporting them, the death of Jews. And I was wondering, and I've interviewed a lot of people about this, and I came to the conclusion it's because historically there was such an absence of meaning for our children and on campuses as well, that murder could become glorified. They could become the new heroes of society. So what do we have to do about it? Well, I, as a therapist in my book, The Psychology of the Soul, provide some solutions. And what I did is as follows in the book. I say, listen, and I do this with my clients all the time, pick your top values that are important to you. Maybe that's loving kindness. Maybe that's courage. Maybe that's becoming a good citizen. And pick a few great experiences that you want to have, meaningful experiences. It could be volunteering. It could be hiking. It could be going to the Grand Canyon. It could be learning a language. So pick 3 top values.
It could be reading your book, Rabbi.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. And pick 3 great values and pick 3 meaningful experiences. And I want you to try to accomplish them every day and write about that. And in my book, at the back of my book, I give a 30-day meaningful life workbook. And it's 30 days of reading a Viktor Frankl quote every day. And then journaling, did you fulfill your values today? Did you experience some meaningful experiences today? My prediction as a therapist, and I've seen this with my clients that have depression, addiction, when they do this, they get better after 30 days. So instead of focusing on what you don't have, focusing on what you're needed for and what you can accomplish through your values and meaningful experiences. That's what logotherapy is really about, reorienting a person from the focus on the self to focus to beyond the self, to go from the self to beyond the self. And by focusing on your values, that's a more lucrative place to make real changes. And you can rely upon these values every day, especially because psychotherapy only happens once a week for an hour. We have to give our clients something to do every day. Focusing on values and meaning gives them something to do. And I watch their depression scores go down and their anxiety scores go down as well.
What you're saying is right about young people in some respects, but, there's also been a rebirth of religion on a college campuses. I've done a show on that as well. Do you think that's true? And what do you make of that?
Well, that's what Frankl was saying. There's this religio, there's this part of us from that other dimension. But I think in American society, John, we're seeing 2 trains go in opposite directions. We have a train just going full out towards meaninglessness on campus, and we see the political implications today. And the other side, we see these inklings of a spiritual revival. We have 2 Americas basically happening right now. And I guess people every generation will rediscover meaning in their lives, but unfortunately, the other side is experiencing tremendous meaninglessness on levels we've never experienced before. Our parents grew up in a society, even though there were these political winds from Europe, whether it's Nazism or communism, they were there already. But the fabric of American society was much more rich. The street wasn't as dangerous. There wasn't the drug addiction that we're experiencing today. There wasn't the meaninglessness on the internet. And I think the generation today is just bombarded with
Where did
negativity.
that come from, Rabbi? Why do you, your view, why did this begin to happen? So, if our parents were a certain way and we were sort of like them, why do you think this began to happen?
Because of Nietzsche. He said God is dead. This all begins historically from the secularism in Western society. If I would have one factor which would predict the fall of the West, it would be the removal of God from mainstream society. That's why I believe it happened 150 years ago, let's say, somewhere around that period. It just took a little bit of time for everything to fall into place in the wrong direction. The domino effect took time. So our parents' generation still had a bit of that religiosity. By our generation and our kids' generation, it began to be lost. And that's what we're seeing. The tidal wave peaked right now, and the meaninglessness exploded. At the same time, you're seeing the explosion of addiction, depression, and suicidal ideation. I believe, as did Viktor Frankl, it all comes back to the rejection of God.
Now, Rabbi, this is, I take it you hang out with a lot of educated, highly, intellectual types. Am I right?
I tried to.
Okay. What do they think about you when you talk about this?
What do they think about me? Well, you have to know what to say and what not to say in certain people. My biggest challenge are other therapists, actually.
But isn't it important that we say what we think? Because I mean, we don't want to be rude, but we want to. And I guess you don't. As the New Testament says, don't cast your pearls before swine. But
Right.
isn't it important that what you're saying is heard, even in places where it's uncomfortable for people to hear it? Because I
Yeah,
happen to agree with you.
well, I know you've taken stands in your own professional life, which people didn't agree with, right? And I
Yeah.
have too. And sometimes there's a cost to it. There's a cost to taking a chance and standing for your values. But I think your values are going to outlive you. I'd rather die with my values at hand than live a false life of inauthenticity, to be honest with you. So I always go to that very important point is let me be authentic. Let me access my religio, of course, in the context of manners and listening to people also at the same time. I do a lot of reflective listening as a therapist, but I try to live with authenticity. And I think that's the greatest predictor of happiness. And that's what Frankl said as well. Those who seek happiness, it will run away from them. You have to seek meaning, and happiness will ensue. It will follow you. So it's a bit counterintuitive in our society, but I believe we have to just live lives of spirituality, of authenticity, of love for other people. And I also believe it's contagious, to be honest with you. People will follow you. They may not realize it once, but they'll start following you if you're a good person and you are influential, being authentic as well.
Rabbi, so when you do your counseling, I don't know if we want to call it counseling, but your treatment, whatever, are you combining both the therapy with logotherapy and the notion of God? Do you do it together?
Well, let me be very careful about this. If somebody doesn't want to talk about God, I'm not introducing God to them. I believe in the division, the separation of church and state. I think it's extremely
Right.
important. It is what created American society.
So do I. Yes.
But what about people that want spirituality and can't get it in psychotherapy? Okay, so here's my method. I do the classic psychotherapy. Carl Rogers taught about the importance of reflection and listening. He talked about the importance of unconditional acceptance of your client's experience, a non-critical therapy. So my therapy is very reflective. I listen deeply to my clients' feelings and emotions and their belief systems. But at some point, I pivot because I could talk a lot, what we call in therapy, problem saturated talk. I could also look for solution saturated talk, right? So I could look for each other. So when I do therapy with my clients, I'm doing classical therapy, but I start pivoting at a certain point, looking for emotional and spiritual resources. I'll give you an example, John. For example, a client comes to me and says, I've been depressed for the last 2 years, and I'll rate them between 1 and 10. So how depressed are you? 7. 7's pretty high. 10 is the worst. 7. There's my question. Have there been any times over the last 2 years where you haven't been at a level 7 of depression, but have been a level 4 or 3, a little better? And they say, yes. Well, when? Well, I was exercising a few weeks ago. I exercised twice. I felt better. Okay. I was going out with friends and I felt a little bit less depressed. I went to church. I went to synagogue. I felt a little better. So I say, oh, there's my resource for them. Things they're doing that they know they can do well, that really help them. The client really knows the answer to their problems. And so I sit there detecting all these great resources, friendship, spirituality, and I start focusing, talking more about those things with them. And then I give them some homework for my book to start focusing on them. So I do the therapy, and for those who want it, I start shifting towards spiritual resources. And I'm not the only one that says that. There's a very famous psychologist, Warrenberg. She said that we're lying to our clients. We're only meeting with them 50 minutes a week. What are they going to do the other 6 days a week? We have to give them spiritual practice. She meant spiritual in a more secular sense, whatever that
Right,
means. It
right.
could be yoga. It could be hiking. But for those that are deeply in touch with their spirituality, let's ignite that within them. And that is very healthy. That gives them a greater sense of who they are. And it really gives them the sense, going back to Auschwitz and Viktor Frankl, at a certain point, we don't know why bad things happen to man. We don't know. But those who have a sense that there may be a purpose in the universe, whether you accept intelligent design, I believe in intelligent design, for example, if you access that, your life just becomes better. You can live through the hard times because you know there's a purpose in life. But if you live in a world of meaninglessness, how are you going to feel? How do you react to the worst traumas, which everybody's experiencing? Most of us have experienced deep traumas, whether
Yes.
loss of families. How are we going to experience life in a positive way? We can't do that unless we sense there's some vision of meaning in the world, and that's a lucrative place to go again to help people heal.
Rabbi, I was talking to some of the folks at SiriusXM. I love them because they let me do a lot of things that I want to do. And so having Frankel's grandson on to talk about his grandfather and meaning and a lot of quotes from the book, somebody said they'd heard it. And I said, look, I did that because everybody experiences trauma and suffering at some point. The issue is, how do we give them hope in the midst of suffering and trauma, right? And I think that's what you try to do. When your friends ask you, or your compatriots ask you, okay, so God is good, he uplifts us and everything else, explain the Holocaust to me. What do you tell them?
Can't explain the Holocaust. That's between God and the same question is, why does any person die? Times 6 million. The question is, why does anybody die in the first place? But he did say like this, and I go a little even further than Viktor Frankl in my book. So he had a formula: D equals S minus M. Despair equals suffering minus meaning. Meaning, if you can give somebody a little bit of meaning, right, it gets rid of that sense of despair. I'm willing to look at people and ask, and I do this very sensitively, and I do this from the third person. Have you ever seen anything bad happen to somebody that actually turned out better than you expect? Have you ever seen something happen to them which challenged them, which they grew to the next level? And most people say yes. Well, I ask them then on their own personal level, have you experienced things in your life which you found painful that you actually grew from? That's kind of level one where I go. Then I ask the big question. Now, a lot of therapists are scared to ask this question. And I always a bit scared myself, but I ask it. Could you find any meaning in your own suffering? People will think deeply. I give them a few minutes, and they will come up with remarkable things. People are much more powerful than we believe. And when they can find some meaning in their own suffering, I cannot define that for my client. I cannot tell them why. I'm not God.
And
I'm
what
not
did they tell you, some of them? Give me an example or two of what they say that was so encouraging to you.
People will tell me that they became a better person from their suffering. People will tell me they become a more sensitive person. People will tell me they discover new treasures in their life because they had to do a lot of self-reflection and go through that pain and work through the pain. People always report they became stronger, they worked through it. That's some of the things I discover about their inner lives with them. Some of my clients have lost children during stillbirth. An example in my book, a woman had been for a lot of therapy. She had a stillbirth. She told me the agony of stillbirths is that no one really understands it, and there's no one really to talk to most of the time. And she couldn't find help in therapy either way. So I said, well, what do you think you could accomplish from that stillbirth after going through all this pain and psychotherapy with me? She says, I want to help other women deal with their own stillbirths. And she started a foundation. She took some coaching classes. She went out and she turned her tragedy into a triumph. And there's remarkable people. And I know your experience in politics and presidential run as well, but I can tell you for a fact, most great people in this world, most great people are people that suffered. So trauma could be something which they could take and they could destroy them, or they could take it by the tail and turn it around. Trauma is a tremendous energy. And if we utilize that energy, we could change the world with it. So many famous people and many famous musicians I followed for many years, great famous people, many have suffered, but they could use the suffering and find meaning through it and actually change the world through their own experience.
Yeah, it's funny, Rabbi. Without getting into details, I went through a period of intense suffering back in regard to my mother and father. But recently, because I've gotten a little older, I've now experienced some health things, and nothing that threatens me, but things that have now made me a lot more aware of other people's challenges. Let me ask you about these, and so I completely agree. You're a gem, by the way. You're a jewel. You're really great. I'm going to ask you about two other issues: silence and solitude. How important are they?
So important. You know, one of the things and I'm a marriage therapist as well. I do marriage counseling. I say, I want to show you guys the marriage counselor. And I say, this is it, guys. Here's your marriage. Here's the marriage killer. I'm sorry. Here's the marriage killer. Here's the marriage killer.
Your phone.
Your phone is the marriage killer.
Why? Why is it? Because you don't talk anymore.
You go to people's homes. Every kid, every teenager, every parent. I go to my home. Sometimes in my own home. You see four of my teenagers. And everybody's on their own. I say, put away your phones. And in fact, one of the books I wrote about 20 years ago is called At Risk, Never Beyond Reach. And I asked a very famous rabbi psychiatrist, Rabbi Twersky, very famous man. He wrote the introduction to my book. I said, what's the greatest cure for teens at risk? You know what he answered me based upon research? He said, family mealtime.
Yeah.
It is one of the most important things. I wouldn't say that's silence or solitude, but it is a form of silence from technology. And I think people are so addicted, John, today. We're living in a world, everyone, including myself, I'm on my phone dealing with messages and problems and ordering things. And I'm always on my phone. But it's killing us because what we don't do is we don't go into moments of silence and reflection. And therefore, we don't get the richness of ourselves. But just turn away that phone, go on a phone fast, put it away when you walk in the door. A guy comes home, a woman comes home after work. Go on a phone fast for 1 hour between 6 and 7. Put away your phones. The world will not fall apart in 1 hour. Trust me. Unless you're a cardiac surgeon and have to run back to surgery. Most of us are not, right? Put away the phone and just think and experience, listen to your spouse, listen to your kids. You'll find life enriching. Your anxiety and depression levels will go down through that silence.
Rabbi, there is a great philosopher, man of faith by the name of Dallas Willard, and he wrote a book about the spirit of the disciplines, which are things like fasting, silence, solitude. Don't just try to gobble. Don't try to, if you're rich, don't try to be so blatant about it, or don't soothe yourself on all of your riches. I mean, it's very, very interesting. I commend it to you, Dallas Willard, Spirit of the Disciplines. Well, listen, you're a jewel. I so enjoyed this, and keep talking. And maybe I'll see you sometime when I'm in New York visiting one of my daughters.
Come and visit. We'd love to see you in person.
Well, maybe you got to come to me, because you know how hard it is to get around and go from Midtown to Brooklyn. No, I have to have you come. So no, okay.
I'll join you in Manhattan. Don't worry.
All right, sir. Thank you, Rabbi.
Pleasure.